Well, good morning, Boker Tov. Welcome in to Mishkan Katan. It's a pleasure to be with you as always. It's been said that the follower of Yeshua, the child of God, must be on guard of his or her soul, and never more so than after a period of prosperity, of feeling fat in one's soul. And we'll return to that theme of fatness of the soul later on toward the end of the broadcast. But David was in such a period when he wrote Psalm 16, which we studied last week. He looked forward to dwelling in the presence of God forever. However, in between Psalm 16 and Psalm 17, David committed the heinous sins of complacency, lust, adultery, and murder. We find the story in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Before we plunge into Psalm 17, let's look at verse 1 of 2 Samuel 11 for just a moment. In the spring, at the time when kings go out to war, David sent out Yoav, which is Joab in Hebrew, Yoav, his servants who were with him, and all Israel. They ravaged the people of Ammon and laid siege to Rabbah. But David stayed in Jerusalem. David stayed in Jerusalem. Look at David's complacency and indolence here. He was not an old man at this point. He was a man in the prime of his life, probably in his 40s, 50s maybe. He thought, though, that he had it made in all respects. This was a time of year when, after winter was past, the kings rode out to conquer. Yet, what was David doing? He was relaxing in his palace, resting on his laurels, apparently spiritually as well as physically. Instead, he sent out his head general, Joab, and his army to battle the kingdom of Ammon. Spiritual complacency is never good. It leaves us vulnerable to Satan's attacks. 2 Samuel 11 goes on to say that it was after an afternoon nap that David spied Bathsheba bathing in a pool on the roof of her home. He began to lust after her and eventually committed adultery with her. If that were not enough, he resolved to take her from her husband, who was one of his faithful warriors. He put her husband Uriah into a precarious position in which he would most certainly be slain, and he was. It was, in effect, murder. This awful story is a cautionary tale for each of us. Have you ever said, I would never commit fill in the blank, sin? You'd better be careful in those prideful words. I've been guilty of saying that very thing about something I felt was not a temptation to me at that time. When we do that, it's like waving a red flag in front of a bull, with us being the flag waver and Satan being the bull. It's like that expression, throwing down the gauntlet. You are absolutely inviting the enemy to come after you with a powerful attack in that very area that you crowed about not being an area of temptation for you. Psalm 17, the next psalm in our lineup, was written after this series of life-altering events in David's life. After these awful sins, David had repented wholeheartedly. But he realized that his mistakes had put his nation, his entire nation, at risk. He feared his army might be decimated in the fury of God's retribution on him. In this psalm, he prayed fervently that this would not occur. Furthermore, he began to have doubts about his own relationship with Father Yahweh. This psalm is not mentioned in the New Testament. I always like to look for those cross references if they're present. For now, let's begin to examine the 15 verses of Psalm 17. From the Complete Jewish Bible, verses 1 through 2. A prayer of David. Hear a just cause, Adonai. Heed my cry. Listen to my prayer from honest lips. Let my vindication come from you. Let your eyes see what is right. In verse 1, the word cry of Adonai, heed my cry, is better translated as shouting aloud in prayer. That is, with a raised voice, wailing aloud. Have you ever heard someone wail in prayer? I have. The reference to honest lips indicates that David is conveying the true feelings of his heart to his God. We might as well honestly pour out our hearts to him, as he knows every thought and intent of our hearts anyway. He then, in verse 2, affirms that vindication comes only from the Lord, because he and he only sees perfectly what is right. It's believed by the sages that David is appealing to God to give him leniency because of his many past righteous deeds. That is, that they would outweigh his recent sinful ones. But, in contrast to that, I really believe that the greater spiritual blessings a person is given, the greater their accountability before God. Not that they would receive leniency because of their previous righteous deeds, but that's what the sages say anyhow. All right, moving on to verses 3, 4, and 5. You probed my heart. You visited me at night, and you assayed me without finding evil thoughts that should not pass my lips. Verse 4. As for what others do, by words from your lips, I have kept myself from the ways of the violent. Verse 5. My steps hold steadily to your paths. My feet do not slip. In verse 3, David speaks of the Lord examining him in the nighttime hours, which corresponds to the time period his downward slide into sin with Bathsheba began. She was bathing on the rooftop, and he spied her in the early evening, late afternoon, early evening, and his sin with her occurred later on that night. David speaks of being tested and purged in the aftermath of his sins. A better translation of the second half of verse 3 would be, you have tested me without success. May my scheming no more cross my lips. In other words, a paraphrase of that would be, in your testing of me, Lord God, you found my flaws, that I'm not all that in a bag of chips. May I never allow evil thoughts to even get past my lips in the future. So David here is saying, I need to make my guard even higher. I don't even need to get close to a sin. I don't even need to let evil thoughts get past my lips in the future. Verses 4 and 5 go on as an affirmation from David that he will no longer stray from the straight and narrow path of righteousness. The incident with Bathsheba and Uriah was a severe example of his wandering off the path. In that instance, David most certainly did employ the ways of the violent, albeit trying to make his murderous acts look like a casualty of war. Going on, verse 6. Now I call on you, God, for you will answer me. Turn your ear to me, hear my words. Verse 7, show how wonderful is your grace, Savior of those who seek at your right hand refuge from their foes. That was verses 6 and 7. One of the things I admire about David is his confidence that God hears his prayers and that he will answer. David asks for grace, and then he makes a reference to God's right hand, which is reminiscent of his mention of this in the last verse of Psalm 16, where he says, quote, at your right hand are pleasures evermore, end quote. The reference to David's foes here has a double layer of meaning. He's referring to his spiritual foes and his literal human foes as well, the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Jebusites, and others. The sages point out that, quote, the enemies who threaten my soul, end quote, does not refer to merely physical enemies. David's most potent enemies were not the people from other nations. The most deadly enemies he faced and that we face were the sinful temptations that assailed his own soul. So he's asking for refuge, for protection from both of those. He says in verses 8 and 9, protect me like the pupil of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings. Verse 9, from the wicked who are assailing me. Another translation calls the analogy in verse 8 the apple of your eye. And some of you may have heard that analogy, the apple of his eye. In Hebrew, the expression the pupil of the eye is bavat Aino, or bavat Aino is a little more accurate pronunciation. We find in Deuteronomy 32, verses 10 and 11, a similar reference to these Psalm 17 verses. You could even say David might have been thinking of these verses from Deuteronomy and even quoting the same analogies. Here's Deuteronomy 32, 10 through 11, and listen to how similar these verses are to what we just looked at in verses 8 and 9 of Psalm 17. He found his people in desert country, in a howling, wasted wilderness. He protected him and cared for him, guarded him like the pupil of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up her nest, hovers over her young, spreads out her wings, takes them and carries them as she flies. In Zechariah 2, verse 8, we find another reference to the pupil of God's eye. Here is that verse, Zechariah 2, 8. For Adonai Sabaoth has sent me on a glorious mission to the nations that plundered you. And this is what he says. Anyone who injures you injures the very pupil of my eye. The pupil of God's eye is a term of endearment that Father Yahweh uses for no other people group, no other in Hebrew, nation, no other nation on earth than the physical descendants of Abraham. In Isaiah 14:1, the Lord declares through the prophet Isaiah that he will never abandon his original covenant people, but will instead choose them for the sake of his great name. Therefore, anyone who believes that the church has replaced Israel in God's redemptive plan is making a theological error. Instead, it's just the opposite. The believers in Yeshua and Jesus, both Jew and Gentile, have become a part of Israel and therefore become a partaker in the Almighty's promises to her. we Gentiles, the disciples of Yeshua, who are Gentiles, have been grafted into the original tree that is Israel. As the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 11:18, the disciples of Yeshua do not support the tree, but rather the tree supports us. Speaking of trees, the Hebrew words for tree and bones are similar. The Hebrew word for tree is eitz, and the word for bones is etzim. You hear the z there? It's a common sound in both words. We recently celebrated, in fact, if you're watching this in real time, this past April 16th, we celebrated the Day of the Independence for Israel. But the word atzma'ut comes from the noun etzem, which means bones. Yom ha'atzma'ut is Day of Independence. This name reminds us of the Valley of the Dry Bones story in Ezekiel 37, verses 1 through 6. Hallelujah, that in the physical realm of the earth's nations, Father Yahweh has revived and restored that valley of dry bones that Ezekiel spoke of by bringing the Jewish people back to their ancestral land after centuries of exile, almost 20 centuries to be exact. John J. Parsons of Hebrew for Christians said this week on Facebook, and I quote, "The nation of Israel is Father Yahweh's super sign of God's faithfulness to the world." End quote. Amen. And Hillel Fuld was saying on Facebook this morning that today is the day that we remember the fallen in Israel, those who gave their lives for the nation of Israel. And of course, he couldn't make that post this morning without mentioning his brother Ari, who was murdered about 7 years ago, and ask for prayer for his family. And we need to pray for all who have lost loved ones in such a violent way, giving their lives for the nation of Israel. Well, finally, our Messiah, the Mashiach, made reference to verse 11 here in Deuteronomy 32, when he stood on the Mount of Olives one last time before his Passion Week began, and he cried out, as recorded in Matthew 23, verse 37, "Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, you kill the prophets, you stone those who are sent to you. How often I wanted to gather your children, just as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, but you refused." Now, back to verses 10 through 12 of Psalm 17. These verses further describe these enemies of the soul that David was speaking of earlier in the psalm. This is a description of these people. They close their hearts to compassion. Another version says they are enclosed in their own fat. Remember, I told you we return to that theme of being fat in the soul. It reminds me of that story that the Lord told, the Messiah told, about the man who looked around him and he saw all that he had, and he said, "Oh, look at all this great stuff I have. I'm going to build more barns, bigger barns to house all my stuff." And that very night, he died. That man was feeling fat in his soul. We need to be very careful and always have an attitude of gratitude for every blessing that our Father has given us, and be generous. Be generous, not close our hearts to compassion, as it says here in verse 10. Going on with the second part of verse 10 now. They speak arrogantly with their mouths. Verse 11, they track me down, they surround me, they watch for a chance to bring me to the ground. Verse 12, they're like lions eager to tear their prey, like young lions crouching in ambush. People who are arrogant have an inflated view of themselves. Here, the arrogant person who opposes God's people probably thinks that they're lions. Talking about Ari Fool, that great hero of Israel of our century. Ari's first name means lion. Lion. And when he was named that, Hillel says, when he was named that, his parents said it wasn't a common name to name a son. But now, baby boys all over Israel are named Ari. It's become a common name. Well, as I was saying, these people who oppose God's people think they're lions. But you know what? In the end, they're merely toothless, declawed tomcats. All right, let's finish this psalm. Here are the last 3 verses 13 through 15. This is a shorter one. The next one's long. Arise, Adonai, confront them, bring them down. With your sword, deliver me from the wicked. Verse 14. With your hand, Adonai, from human beings, from people whose portion in life in this world. You fill their stomachs with your treasure. Their children will be satisfied too, and will leave their wealth to their little ones. Verse 15. But my prayer in righteousness is to see your face. On waking, may I be satisfied with a vision of you. One of my favorite things to do is to pray as soon as I wake up. In the Jewish tradition, I typically, when I first wake up, I pray the prayer, Father Yahweh, King of Kings, thank you for reuniting my soul with my body. Great is thy faithfulness. And then I thank the Lord for that man lying beside me, that I can still hear him breathing over there. And then I get up, I go into the restroom, and what do we usually all do when we get up first thing in the morning? So there's a prayer for that, believe it or not, a prayer of thankfulness for that. And it goes something like this. It says, Father Yahweh, O great Elohim, in your wisdom, you created within mankind many openings and many cavities. It is well known before your throne of glory that if but one of them were to be blocked or but one of them were to be ruptured, it would be impossible to stand before you. So we thank you, O great King of Kings. And so that's that prayer. And then, there's prayer for when you wash your hands. Of course, there's prayer for the food we eat. But David prays something similar here, doesn't he? He says, upon waking, I want to see your face. Although the sages are divided on this point, I believe David is still speaking of the opulent, corpulent wicked here in these last few verses, 13 and 14, who not only fill their own stomachs with the wealth of the world, but also stuff their children and their grandchildren similarly. I'm not saying it's wicked to be wealthy. I'm saying that riches should be used to lift up and help others who are not so financially blessed as the wealthy person. David was a very wealthy man, and it was his wealth and his power that led him to believe it would be okay to just take Bathsheba, another man's wife. The Hebrew verb for to take is lachach. Lachach. We use that verb in Hebrew in our marriage vows. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? The Hebrew verb lachach. David did not have compassion on Uriah when he took Uriah's wife. In this, he had behaved no better than the wicked he speaks of and condemns here. And I believe he knew this after being reprimanded by the prophet Nathan, and that he repented from it. But when you have fallen down into the muck and mire of sin, you can more easily recognize it in others since you yourself have been there. In verse 15, as we said a moment ago, David affirms that his prayer, his one desire, his main thing that needs to remain the main thing, because that's the main thing, his only desire post-repentance, post-confession, post-restoration is to keep his eyes focused on his God, to seek to see his face, to be fully satisfied in him. May we all desire the same and do likewise. Let's move on now to Psalm 18. Although many Psalms, around half of them, were composed by David, as you probably know, this one is referred to by the sages as the Song of David. Hold your place here and then turn to 2 Samuel 22. I hope you have your copy of the scriptures with you, and I'll give you a second to turn there. 2 Samuel 22. Now, when you get there, I want you to look at this 22nd chapter of 2 Samuel and compare it to Psalm 18. Take just a moment and kind of flip back and forth and compare them. Just the verses, just compare them. Are you seeing it? Extraordinary, isn't it? Again, like last week when we studied Psalm 53 and one of the other Psalms, I can't remember which one, and I didn't write it down, but the two were virtually the same. Remember when we studied that? Okay, so we have a similar phenomenon here, right? These two chapters are virtually the same, Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22. The Jewish sage Rashi believed that Psalm 18 was composed by David in his old age, like he was reminiscing, he was remembering back, even though the psalm speaks of David's deliverance from King Saul. Ibn Ezra, another sage, cites 2 Samuel 21:17, which is, of course, just before 2 Samuel 22. But in 2 Samuel 21:17, the nation of Israel had determined that their old and frail king, King David, was no longer able to participate on the battlefield with his army because it was just too dangerous to put the king in that precarious a position. Now, in contrast with Rashi's view, Abarbanel, who wrote a commentary on the book of Samuel, it was actually one book, but in our Christian Bibles, it's divided into two, held the opinion that David composed this psalm in his youth, when he was still enmeshed in trials and tribulations, including having his life threatened repeatedly by King Saul. The sages say, regardless, that the original version of this psalm appears in Psalm 22. It is often recited on the 7th day of Passover, which would be the 22nd of Nisan, which is not that long ago. It's only about 2 weeks ago. We were at 22nd day of Nisan, so it's timely. We're looking at this psalm now. In many homes, a second final Passover Seder is held on the last day of Pesach, of Passover. Harav Gifter believes that this psalm is particularly suited to that occasion because it was on Nisan 22, he says, that the Sea of Reeds was split. And this amazing event, the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, which the Hebrew people participated in through faith. Yes, they had to have the faith to obey. They had to have the gift of faith to put their toes in the water. It said that the waters did not split until Nahshon, I believe was his name, who was the ancestor of Boaz, walked into the water. He put his toes into the water and whew, the sea split by faith. It represents and was the beginning, was the forerunner of all future redemptions. This event, the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, including the greatest redemption of all, the one made for us by our Mashiach, Yeshua. and he will make a final redemption in the millennium when he redeems Israel, the nation. Now, Psalm 18 is a long psalm. It's 51 verses long. So we are not going to examine it verse by verse this morning. I just have about 30 minutes left. We do not have time for that, okay? Instead, we're going to do something different. And here's where you're going to need a pencil if you have one. See if you can rummage around and find a pencil. And I am going to, while you're doing that, I'm going to make some little notes here on this. I am not an artist. If you followed me for any time, you know that I'm not an artist. And don't any of you click the like button for that. I just dare you. All right, so we've got, I've got a little diagram here that I drew. Let me put on my glasses. It's bad enough without me not being able to see what I'm doing. Just one second. All right, so we've got a little diagram here that I want to show you. Now, in my previous teachings, I've used this this same bit of information, but it bears repeating. In the Hebrew Bible, sometimes the writers used a particular device, a particular literary device, and it was called a chiastic structure. A chiastic structure. And I'm going to show you in just a moment what it looks like. Okay. Now, this is a chiastic structure, and they can have as many of these lines as needed. Okay. Can you see that? There we go. Now, in a chiastic structure, the A's more or less match, or they're closely related to each other. The B's, again, closely related to each other. You may want to draw this because I'm going to tell you what in this psalm, each of these lines, what the theme of it is, and you'll be able to see the matchy-matchy, okay? I have to hold this so that the light is just right. The C's match up together. The D's match up together. And then the central, most important point of the whole thing is right here in front of my index finger. It's called the central axis, or the core, or some other centrist bedrock terms such as that. Okay, now, I hope I've not lost you in the weeds. This is going to make more sense in just a minute. We're going to read Psalm 18, but on your piece of paper or in the margin of your scriptures, whichever you're most comfortable doing, I'm going to ask you to make some notes, okay? We're going to group these verses together as we read along. Are you ready? Here we go. All right, 1A is Psalm 18, 1 through 3. And I'll just say the verses because it's all Psalm 18. Okay, 1 through 3. And the theme is God, my deliverer. God, my deliverer. All right, let's read. For the leader, by David, the servant of Adonai, who addressed the words of this song to Adonai on the day when Adonai delivered him from the power of all his enemies, including from the power of Shaul, Saul. He said, I love you, Adonai, my strength. Adonai is my rock, my fortress, and deliverer. my God, my rock, in whom I find shelter, my shield, the power that saves me, my stronghold. All right, did you hear the deliverance theme in there? God, my deliverer. All right, so that's 1A. All right, 1B is found in verses 4 through 6. And the theme for those verses is that David cried out to God for deliverance, and God heard him. David cried to God for deliverance, and God heard him. You might want to shorten that to God heard David's cry, if you don't have much space. God heard David's cry. All right, verses 4 through 6. For the cords of death surrounded me. The floods of Belial terrified me. That's Baal in English. The ropes of Sheol were wrapped around me. The snares of death lay there before me. In my distress, I called to Adonai. I cried out to my God. Out of his temple, he heard my voice. My cry reached his ears. Did you hear our theme there in verse 6? All right, that's 1B. 1B. All right, verses 7 through 19 have the theme of showing God's might in warfare. And remember, these verses talk about how the Lord behaved in this psalm. And remember that David got to see the angel of the Lord in action. This is recorded in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 16. So David's not speaking hypothetically here. He has seen the angel of the Lord in action, in battle. You can look that up and read about it later. 1 Chronicles 21, 16. We don't have time this morning to divert over there and read about that. All right, verses 7 through 19. Let your visual imagination run wild here. Just close your eyes and listen. Then the earth quaked and shook. The foundations of the mountains trembled. They were shaken because he was angry. Smoke rose in his nostrils, and out of his mouth came devouring fire. Sparks blazed forth from him. He lowered heaven and came down with thick darkness under his feet. He rode on a cherub. He flew, swooping down on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his hiding place, his canopy, thick clouds, dark with water. From the brightness before him, there broke through his thick clouds hailstones and fiery coals. Adonai also thundered in heaven. Ha-Elyon sounded his voice. Hailstones and fiery coals. He sent out arrows and scattered them, shot out lightning and routed them. The channels of water appeared. The foundations of the world were exposed at your rebuke, Adonai, at the blast of breath from your nostrils. He sent me from on high. He took me and pulled me out of deep water. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from those who hated me, for they were stronger than I. They came against me on my day of disaster, but Adonai was my support. He brought me out to an open place. He rescued me because he took pleasure in me. Now, verses 20 through 24 describe David's adherence to Torah, which he calls his righteousness, his uprightness. So this is 20 through 24 is 1D, okay? What we just read was 1C. So 1D, the theme of 1D is David's adherence to Torah. That's the theme of 1D, if you're taking notes, right? 1D. And the theme of 1C is God's might in warfare. God's might in warfare. So 1D is David's righteousness, or you might broaden it out to be our righteousness if you're applying this to us. Okay. All right. Verses 20 through 24. Adonai rewarded me for my uprightness. He repaid me because my hands were clean. For I have kept the ways of Adonai. I have not done evil by leaving my God. For all his rulings were before me. I did not distance his regulations from me. I was pure-hearted with him and kept myself from sin. Hence, Adonai repaid me for my uprightness, according to the purity of my hands in his view. So, I tend to believe that David must have written this psalm in his youth, because I think it would have been hard for him to have written those verses after his sin with Bathsheba. Now, verses 25 through 27 are the central axis of this psalm and of this chiastic structure. They are the linchpin of the entire psalm. And the theme there for the linchpin, the theme is that with the merciful, you show yourself mercy. You show yourself merciful. With the merciful, you will show yourself merciful. With a blameless man, you will show yourself blameless. With the pure, you will show yourself pure. With the devious, you will show yourself shrewd. For you will save the humble people and bring down haughty looks. And here it is from the CJB. With the merciful, you are merciful. With a man who is sincere, you are sincere. With the pure, you are pure. But with the crooked, you are cunning. People afflicted, you save. But haughty eyes, you humble. And there's a little, maybe not too much humility in what David said in verses 20 through 24. We have to be really, really careful not to be prideful about our righteous deeds, but to remember that we are empowered to do them by the Spirit who lives within us, that without him we can do nothing. Verses 28 through 30 are 2a. And the theme of verses 28 through 30 is God's righteousness. So 2a, I believe that's right. Oh, let me be sure, because I didn't write it down for some reason. I didn't. God's grace. So 1a, 1d corresponds to 2d. 1d was my righteousness, David's righteousness. 2d, which corresponds with it, is God's grace. So do you see how they play off one another, how they match one another? God's grace. Okay, so verses 28 through 30, I wasn't as careful about writing these down earlier. So, for you, Adonai, light my lamp. Adonai, my God, lights up my darkness. With you, I can run through a whole troop of men. With my God, I can leap a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of Adonai has been tested by fire. He shields all who take refuge in him. Verse 30 is one of the first verses that one of my spiritual mamas made me learn as a young teen. As for God, his way is perfect. Verses 31 through 40 correspond to 2c, and they speak of how Adonai empowered David for battle. Now, if you look back at 1c, the theme of 1c was what? 1c was God's might in warfare, God fighting for Israel. But 2c is God empowering us for warfare. As he empowered David for warfare, he empowers us for warfare. So here we are. These are verses 31 through 40. Read along with me. For who is God but Adonai? Who is a rock but our God? It is God who girds me with strength. He makes my way go straight. He makes me swift, sure-footed as a deer, and enables me to stand on my high places. He trains my hands for war until my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Can your arms bend a bow of bronze? Mine can't, but maybe yours can. Going on. You give me your shield, which is salvation. Your right hand holds me up. Your humility makes me great. You lengthen the steps I can take, yet my ankles do not turn. I pursued my enemies and overtook them without turning back until they were destroyed. I crushed them so that they can't get up. They have fallen under my feet. For you braced me with strength for the battle and bent down my adversaries beneath me. You made my enemies turn their backs in flight, and I destroyed those who hated me. All right, we have 2b in verses 41 through 42. And the theme here is that David's foes cried to God for help, but God did not hear them or show mercy to them. And it corresponds to 1b, where David says, I cried to God for help and he answered me. But in contrast, 2b in the structure, David's enemies cried to God for help and he did not answer or help them. All right, here are those verses, 41 and 42. They cried out, but there was no one to help, even to Adonai, but he did not answer. I pulverized them like dust in the wind, threw them out like mud in the streets. Verses 43 through 50 form the second bookend of this chiastic structure. You see, 2a and 1a are the bookends of this chiastic structure. And again, this chiastic structure has 4 parts in part 1 and 4 parts in part 2 with the central axis in the middle. But you could have 15 in your chiastic structure. You can have as many as are needed. I believe it's the book of Isaiah that people say the entire thing is a chiastic structure. So, that would be massive. It would be interesting to study Isaiah in that way, would it not? Whew, that would be an ambitious undertaking, my friends. I don't know if I'm up to that. But, we're doing Psalms, so the Lord can do anything, right? He can do anything through us. And, David talks about that up there when he says in verse, up there in that section of 31 through 40. It's God who girds me with strength. He makes my way to go straight. He makes me swift, sure-footed as a deer. He enables me to stand on my high places. He trains my hands for war. See, it's all about him and his glory. It's not about us and our glory. No, it's all about him and his glory. Okay, so this is the second bookend of this chiastic structure. This is 2b, and it's verses 43 through 50. You also freed me from the quarrels of my people. You made me head of the nations. A people I did not know now serve me. The moment they hear of me, they obey me. Foreigners come cringing to me. Foreigners lose heart as they come trembling from their fortresses. Adonai is alive. Blessed is my rock. Exalted be the God of my salvation. The God who avenges me and subdues people under me. He delivers me from my enemies. You lift me high above my enemies. You rescue me from violent men. That part of that verse 46 Reminds me of that song, and blessed be the rock of my salvation. Remember that song? Yeah, I can't sing any more of it than that. You should be glad. All right. So going on now, we had the second bookend, and we're going to finish up here. This is the last part of that. So I give thanks to you, Adonai, among the nations. I sing praises to your name. Great salvation he gives to his king. He displays grace to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. And that last verse there is messianic, isn't it? Great salvation he gives to his king. King Yeshua didn't need personal salvation, of course, but he gave to our Messiah the gift of salvation that he gave to us, his body, his bride. And he displayed grace to his anointed. The word Mashiach in Hebrew means anointed one. And to David and his descendants forever. And of course, Mashiach was a descendant of King David. So we bless the name of the Lord today. And that finishes Psalms 17 and 18 today. Well, I sort of just jumped into it this morning without much fanfare, and I have a couple of minutes left here at the end. So let me just again thank you for being with me in the study of the Psalms. I hope it's blessing you, and please invite others to join in with us as we study the Psalms. Each one is so different, isn't it? It's just like walking through a room and greeting a bunch of unique individuals. The Psalms are just unique, each one. So now also, please invite people to subscribe, to watch here on Lamb live, if possible, because that's what Lamb is all about. It's a live internet TV station, and it's a panoply of gifted teachers. I'm not calling myself a gifted teacher, but there's a panoply of gifted teachers here at Lamb. You may not agree with all of them, and that's okay. We don't all agree either, but that's all right. We respect each other as Torah scholars and Bible scholars, and we give what the Lord has given to us, and we do it for the glory of his name. So invite someone to watch Lamb and to check out some of the other producers. That's what they call us, content producers here at Lamb. And then if you missed the live broadcast, please remember that it is here at Lamb for the next 6 days. This video, if you're watching it live, it will be here at Lamb in the on-demand section for the next 6 days. If you want to learn about Psalm 17 and 18 from me after that, you'll have to go to my YouTube channel. Facebook has gotten to where it only keeps my videos for 30 days. So I'm disappointed in that, but I guess, I don't know, maybe they ran out of bandwidth. I don't know what could have prompted that, but at any rate, they only keep my videos on my Resplendent Daughter Facebook page now for 30 days. So if you want to watch it there within 30 days, you're welcome to do so. But they are all on my YouTube channel. My YouTube channel, which is going across the bottom of your screen. Go there and click on the tab that says Playlists, and you'll find a playlist called Messianic Lamb TV Network. And every video I've ever done for Lamb is there. And they're in reverse chronological order. So the newest ones are at the top of the playlist, or at least that's where they're supposed to be. Sometimes they get misordered, and I have to go in and reorder them for some reason. I'm not really sure why that is, but sometimes they do that. But you can find them roughly in order on the playlist, Messianic Lamb TV Network. And unless they ban me or something, God forbid, that's where you'll find them. So thank you again for tuning in here at Mishkan Katan. Without any further ado, I hope you're counting the Omer. And as we march on to Shavuot, I look forward to seeing you next week back here. So without anything else, I will say shalom, shalom, lehitraot. See you next week. If you missed today's show or want to watch it again, or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lambnetwork.tv, where you will find the show and all the other live Lamb Show archives in the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell someone about the Messianic Lamb Network. We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussions, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the lambnetwork.tv website. I'm Gena Hood, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.